Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a couple things out here on the table that I'm going to use to feed some of my worms with. Stuff you got over here in this bag, it's just a bunch of like small particle stuff that I fished out of the bottom of my freezer bag that I keep my worm food in. It's all the really small stuff that should break down pretty quickly in a worm bin, because the bins that I'm feeding are my two oldest active red wiggler bins. They're up there on the shelf. We'll talk a little bit about them more in a moment, but besides the food that I've got here, which is just little vegetable and fruit scraps, just general kitchen scraps in here, I've got a couple other things that we've typically given to our worms during feedings. It's number here is just coffee, used coffee grounds. And what you see there in that little tub, those are pulverized eggshell. And the pulverized eggshell serves as sort of a form of grit for the worms. Worms do need grit to go hand in hand with the food that they're eating to help digest it. Now the bins that I'm targeting for today are the ones up here on this top shelf that you see in the screen, the two on the left. And I've got a couple notes written down about these two systems over here. The older of the two systems is 114 days old at this point. It's the one in the middle there. And in that system, you know, it's not just red wigglers, even though I've got it categorized here as red wigglers and that these are my two oldest red wiggler systems. In that one system, I believe there are actually a bunch of other types of worms too. Let's see, what are they? I think there's some European night crawlers mixed in there, as well as some Indian blue worms. So that's kind of just a mixed bag of different types of worms. The other bin that we're going to be feeding, though, the 92-day-old system over there, that's pretty much red wigglers only, or exclusively red wigglers for sure. Last week we saw a bunch of little tiny, what appeared to be potworms. Not even that tiny. Some of them looked actually quite bigger than what you would typically expect a potworm to look like. There might have been a little bit of excess moisture in there, so we did not put the plastic coverings on. Most of my systems have a plastic piece of covering on them to keep the water vapor from evaporating and drying out too quickly in there. So in that one, it seemed like because of the excess moisture, we're allowing a little bit of evaporation to just happen in there. And I'll be curious to see how things are progressing in that one. Here too, I've got some information about how many times each system's been fed up until now. So in this case, it's going to be the 16th and 13th feedings of these two systems. Well, let's get to work, and we'll see more once we get these up on the bench and we can see what's in the boxes. All right, let's get to it. Okay, so this is the one that does not have plastic coverings. You can see it's just a sheet of newspaper. The whole idea is that without plastic covering it, hopefully there's a little bit of extra evaporation happening here. Paper is really not meant to hold the moisture down. Hopefully it's allowing for a lot of it to escape out of here. The other thing that we were a little unsure of was how this towel is either contributing or detrimenting the system. I know that cottons and other natural fabric materials can be composted, so this was my first stab at it. I've got one other system where I've got pieces of towel composting, but they're actually down below the surface of the material. Here I figured I would grab a piece of the towel and I try to use it as a kind of a top covering surface under the plastic that I usually cover up with. I thought that maybe it would put it right in the line of fire of where most of the moisture collects, and that it would expose the material to a lot of worm traffic and maybe accelerate its breakdown process. But you can see little tiny flying insects here and there on it. It is a deviation from what I normally do, and I don't even have good experience at this point in terms of gauging whether it's doing well or not. But I haven't really been able to see any sort of major benefit to doing it this way either. So I'm almost wondering if I might be better off here trying to drive things in this bin back to something of more of a kind of a standard approach that I'm a little bit more accustomed to, so that I can more effectively troubleshoot. So I mean, just by eliminating the towel is where I believe we saw a lot of those little white worms that we thought were potworms. I mean, right here on the surface I'm seeing something that does not resemble a typical composting worm. And I mean, this is the system that I mentioned has the multiple different types of worm breeds in it. But whether they're red wigglers or European night crawlers or Indian blue worms, despite that name blue worm. They all have a pinkish, reddish color, and this thing has no such color. And you know, whether you're talking about a really small baby composting worm or a fully grown one, you know what I'm talking about. They've all got this kind of, you know, pinkish, reddish color to them. So this little white thing here on my middle finger squirming around, my suspicion is that it's a potworm. I'm no expert, but I just felt like I was seeing a little bit too much of them recently. So trying to dry things here was mainly spurred on by me noticing a whole bunch of those little suckers in here, and me wanting to sort of drive their numbers down by allowing things in here to dry out a little bit and making the environment a little bit less hospitable for them. And you know, all these flying insects I could see crawling around everywhere. Now that I've sort of started disturbing the surface, I could tell that a lot of them are probably kind of crawling in between all these little cracks and crevices and making themselves at home all over the place. So here too, another one of these little white potworms, I believe. I did theorize that these were potworms in my last video, and I don't think anybody in the comments corrected me. In fact, I think some people even did point out that even though they are pretty big, bigger than you would normally expect, it's not unusual for them to be able to grow that large in ideal conditions. So I'm still dealing with this, as my theory is that these are potworms, and if I want to drive their numbers down, I've got to reduce moisture here. All right, I feel like I'm chit-chatting a lot. Now, I've been feeding down the middle recently in all my systems. But last feeding was a little different from usual. It was material that I had run through the food processor. So what you're seeing here is an example of it, a little handful of it, which clearly hasn't even been infiltrated by the worms. And the little white specks that you see scattered onto it, I do believe that I added grit at that time too. So I think I had already sprinkled in some crushed eggshell during the last feeding. The last feeding was 9 days ago, and I suspected that after that much time, a whole bunch of this really, really well ground up particle matter would have been consumed by now. You know, maybe just the fact that it was sort of in chunks, frozen chunks. Came in little blocks. I had no really good way of being able to sort of blend it in or anything like that. I just hacked off a few chunks of it from the big block of this stuff that I had, and then I placed them in here kind of whole. So what we're seeing here is leftovers from the previous feeding. All stuff that you would have kind of expected to see gone within a few days, but maybe the only reason it didn't get infiltrated was because of the fact that it was clumped together the way it was. So I'm just making an effort here to see if I could sort of blend it in at this point, you know. I'm sure it's all pretty heavily infiltrated by all the microorganisms that inhabit a bin like this. And, you know, right here, obviously, you can see mold growing on some of it. All the mold and bacteria and microbes that really do the sort of the starting breakdown of the material, and then the worms come in later and kind of finish off the job. That's really what we want to see evidence of, and I could clearly see it's happening here. But I think by blending all this stuff in a little bit as we encounter it, it's going to also help get the stuff broken down. Just here and there I encounter a larger chunk of something, and I just can't seem to resist the urge to satisfy my curiosity of trying to figure out what it is that I'm bumping into. Ooh, lots of worms hanging out down here low. A lot of moisture down here and lots of worms. Even more worms than what were in the feeding area. Interesting. Maybe the worms were not really digging the fact that the top surface was drying off as much as it was. This is a pretty good chunk of, I think, avocado. You can even see there's some of the avocado remaining in here still. The shell is actually breaking apart, just shattering in my hand. So whatever, we'll just leave it over in that corner, which is where it was. Prior to me starting into the center feeding of this bin, I was actually alternating the feeding location each time, so I was going from corner to corner. So each of these corners was fed at a different point in time, going back in time. And it was sort of a clockwise rotation. So if we were to actually check here, this was the last corner that received one of those pocket feedings. If there were going to be leftovers, then this would probably be the place to find them. Or maybe just a lot of worms working on that stuff that's already had a few weeks to break down. The only stuff that's really holding out on this one These chunks of pineapple. Pieces of, just a couple pieces. I thought I saw another one somewhere too. Not sure what this is. Probably, I don't know. I think it's actually part of an avocado pit. Seems to be breaking apart pretty readily in my hands. Since things are still pretty damp in here, I think it's going to benefit the bin for me to kind of stir it all up. And we've already done a good job stirring up all around here and down the middle for the most part. So by doing this, we also kind of get a little peek at how these older corners are progressing with their feedings from weeks and weeks ago. So far, I think the pineapple was the biggest chunk of leftover. You know, otherwise, there's other small things that we bumped into, like pieces of pits and things, which would naturally take longer. The skin of an avocado, the outer peel, all these harder things will naturally take a little bit longer. But all the softer type stuff, almost all the softer type stuff has been consumed for the most part. Here too, this is just a piece of asparagus, and the inner part of it is a lot softer, so that was gobbled up right away. It's just the outer skin is a little tougher. It's taking a bit longer for the worms to eat it. I do almost feel like I'd like to return the plastic covering to this system, but maybe further drying would actually benefit the system, especially since the food that we're adding is also going to bring with it some additional moisture. As these little vegetable and fruit scraps begin to break down, or even sooner, even when they just start thawing out from having been frozen, they'll start emitting a bunch of moisture. And once they start breaking down too, they'll also start dropping some extra moisture. So since we already know we're adding additional moisture at this point, we don't want things to get more wet. So I think it does make good sense to keep things covered pretty much the way we found it. I'm just debating whether I want to return that piece of towel the way we found it on top, and perhaps leave this covered with only that newspaper that was on top. You know, as interesting as it is to see what happens to a beach towel over many, many months in a worm bin, on these older systems of mine, I'd really rather just try to focus more on seeing the bin make it to the finish line, and then maybe use younger bins, different systems that have not come this far already, to do little tests on. So at this point, I'd really like to see the bin, you know, get to the finish line, let the material in there be harvested, and get the worms working in a fresh environment. So, all right, enough inspection and chatting. Let's get the food that we bought down here for them dropped in. Besides the really tiny little fragments, there was also a couple pieces of cabbage leaves that were just a little bit larger. These sort of leafy things usually go pretty quick, so that should be of no concern. Well, here too is a piece of asparagus. That'll take a little while too, but whatever. I guess the criteria for what ended up in this feeding was just based on pretty much the size. Anything that was really small and was kind of floating around at the bottom of the bag was all gathered together and made up this collection of food items. And I think what remains in the bag is kind of like half. So let's leave that rest for the other system we're feeding. Ooh, that's a lot of grit. Whatever. It's okay. We'll put some grit in. We'll put some coffee in. Here too, I don't have a lot of coffee either. Let's save some for the other one. And we're pretty much done here. So I am definitely leaning towards skipping the towel covering. I'd love to see this stuff dry out a little bit more. I'd love to see fewer pot worms. Even here, I just saw one right there squirming around right in the middle of the screen there for you. And I'd really like to, I don't know, I'd like to have worm bins that are occupied by the types of worms that I want, you know, working in there. And you know, pot worms, they're also doing, you know, a part of the work. They're all helping to break stuff down and everything. But, you know, if I've got composting worm systems, I'd like to be composting with the composting worms. And if other creatures make it in there to help a little bit, I'll tolerate it in most cases to a certain level. But I'd like to keep it in control, you know. I just want to keep it in check. So I think we're going to go for further drying in this system. So this top layer of materials is going to get pretty hard, kind of the way we found it when we first came in here. But that's fine. We'll stir it all in at some point in the future, get it all rehydrated, and then expose some of the more damp stuff that's below to the surface next time we come in here. And hopefully this will help contribute to the drying of the system a little bit. The towel will remain off. We'll just cover up with this pretty puny little piece of paper. It almost does seem like this piece of paper is becoming a nice little, you know, welcoming mat for these flying insects. And, you know, hey, come on in, you're sheltered and there's a lot of food in here for you. Makes me wonder if I might want to try to cover with something a little bit more thorough. Oh, whatever. I'm just going to get on to feeding the next bin. I could always do some fine-tuning of this system at a later time. All right, let's move on. All right, so now, I don't know, something about this system, nothing about it really stands out in my mind, so hopefully it's kind of like that no news is good news sort of situation, where the reason I'm not thinking about it is because there's no problems that need to be addressed. Although that could be a mistake. I mean, I'm seeing lots and lots of these little flying insects everywhere. I think as I tap the cardboard, I've got this feeling that they're up inside the corrugated. I'm not sure. I think I did knock a few more out. So, I don't know. Usually just by pretty much the slightest amount of pressure, you touch these little guys and you pretty much squish them. So, I'm going to just come in here like the big monster and try to do away with as many of them as I can. I definitely don't like what I'm seeing here. So, I've got to come up with a game plan to try to reduce this situation. I am suspicious that it could be this piece of cardboard drawing their attention and giving them a nice place to creep into as well. So maybe here too we'll have to come up with some other form of covering that's not as hospitable to these little flying insects that we're seeing everywhere. Sometimes I wonder if it's enough just to have this paper covering right over the material inside the bin the way I like to do, and then maybe just a sheet of plastic on top. That cardboard on the very top was really just meant to provide a little bit of protection from the light coming in to help keep things nice and dark under there. Thinking that that would promote more worm traffic, but you know, if I've got to let a little bit of light in by not putting that piece of cardboard back, and if it limits the opportunities for all these little flying insects to find a home, then hopefully I'm going a step in the right direction. Hopefully I'm working off of a correct theory that that's where they're really sort of nesting. Hopefully it's not down under here. So then, yeah, maybe here too, it's really just a matter of getting rid of that cardboard covering. Maybe it was the cardboard here, maybe it was the towel on the other one. Maybe those were the things that were sort of providing these flying insects with a real hospitable place to take shelter and also have a supply of moisture and food and everything. But I think we're going to have to change things to kind of make the space a little less enticing for them to come over and hang out in. Oh, this piece of paper is so shy I can't really lift it as a single piece of paper. It's just falling apart into shreds as I touch it. So whatever, we'll just mix it in as bedding. You know, this bin, 92 days of age. I usually, you know, as the bins get older and I want to start steering them towards harvest, or I anticipate that they'll be getting harvested pretty soon, I try to limit the amount of bedding that I put in, since bedding usually does take a little longer to break down than just your basic foods, cardboard, paper, stuff like that. I haven't really taken that measure in this bin, I don't think, yet. I think I've still been applying bedding here. And maybe we will just replace that one piece of paper that was covering where the feeding was. But here too, I think I'm just going to take a sort of more conservative approach, and if we really want some bedding, you know, we could go fishing around for it. Like, here's an older piece of bedding that goes back a couple of feedings. If we really want to include a little bit of this stuff with the fresh application of food. We can collect it up from other places, I think. You might have noticed in the other bin, it's not much older than this one, but it is a few weeks older. In there, we didn't even see any traces of large chunks of bedding, really, because there I've been withholding the addition of bedding for some time, trying to really allow things to break down to the point where it's almost castings only in there. Here too, I believe that's just another chunk of pineapple. It seems to take a little bit longer for it to break down, but I'll just put it back in that corner because that's where it was when I originally fed in that corner with pineapple. And it does seem like the pineapple is one of the few things that's still sticking around, probably because it's, you know, the most recent feeding over there. And here too, I'm finding a little chunk of paper we can also salvage and recycle to use as bedding to go with today's fresh feeding. You know, if it's just a piece of jumbled up paper in the corner, then it's not going to get a lot of action. I think it'll probably benefit the paper to be positioned near the food that we're adding today. I don't know, the rest of it does seem like it might just be little scraps of different types of food, but I can't really recognize what they are. Here and there. You know, maybe I'll just try to tear things apart a bit just to further help the breakdown process, but usually I like to keep stuff intact so we can see how its progression occurs over time. Like this, you might recognize that this is sort of the butt end of a bunch of bananas, where all the different bananas connect up to the bunch. And I figure this would be an interesting thing to see, you know, deteriorate over time. You can still see it's in pretty good shape. Probably goes about a month back. So that's just another slightly larger, interesting object that we included in one of our feedings that we're getting to see the breakdown process occur in. But at this point, I don't know. I think, have we already inspected the other two corners? What the heck? Let's take a peek in there too, and then we'll jump in here. We fed the same way in this bin too, with that material that was run through the food processor. It was all, you know, tiny particles, far smaller than what we're feeding today. I'm curious to see if we're going to find leftovers of that. See, like in this corner already, I think there's even a little bit more dryness. Not only just a lack of food in this corner, but also less moisture. But I am finding little bits of recyclable bedding, paper type stuff. So let's include it in our little collection that we've got piling up over here. I think it'll be good to place it in with the next feeding, with our fresh feeding that's going in today. Here too, a piece of paper we can recycle, and something, I don't know, oh, this must be part of that last feeding, a chunk of that pulverized food processed food. Huh, I guess it's not enough for it to be really fine, chopped up. It's also got to be spread around. Otherwise the worms can't seem to just get into it, or whatever the case may be. So I guess that kind of officially lets us start poking around in the last feeding. Much more of the same here, little chunks of leftover of that ground up food processed food, and some paper that we can recycle to go with it. I don't know, this corner here, I don't know, did we look in there yet? This would be the corner that will go the farthest back in terms of the pocket feedings, the one that has had the greatest amount of time to make progress on what was placed in there. Yeah, not a lot of leftovers in there for sure, just a lot of castings. Some worms hanging around, still polishing off what's in there. You can see in this bin too, there's a lot of leaf stems. I usually use leaves early on in a bin's life cycle, but as they get older, you won't find me using leaves, mainly because of their little stems. I don't want to have tons and tons of leaf stems littering my finished compost, or, you know, have leaf stems holding me back from harvesting a batch just because I think that stuff's going to need more time for the worms to break it down. Usually I'll just start withholding the use of that sort of stuff that I know is going to take a long time from these older bins, and try to give them stuff that, you know, seems like it's going to get broken down pretty quickly. But here too, you know, this ground up food, something that you would have thought would have probably all been gone in the matter of 9 days since it was added. You could see is still present in some pretty large chunks in some places. So whatever, here too, we'll just sort of try to blend the stuff in a little bit. Maybe salvage some of the paper that's, you know, surrounding it in places. just sort of get it into the neighboring material so the worms can more easily get at it and eat it all up. At the same time, we'll just make some room for today's additional food. Maybe some more recyclable paper or cardboard or something. Well, we don't need much, but it is kind of nice. I think it's kind of a nice thing to have right there next to the food. Sometimes I place it in right under the food, so as the food sort of thaws out and its moisture comes out of it, then the moisture sort of doesn't just drop to the bottom of the bin and make a puddle. It drops into the paper or leaves or whatever it is that I'm using for bedding at that time, and sort of soaks it with all the juices and everything that comes out of the frozen foods as it thaws and as it breaks down. Alright, so we'll do the same. We'll take our little collection of paper bits and whatever else it was, maybe some cardboard too, it's hard to say. Some of it's definitely breaking down pretty nicely. Do I have any more? Yeah, we did find quite a bit of this stuff, didn't we? I think by placing it down here near the food, it'll be in the middle, which is where we're going to be feeding from now on. It'll gain the benefit of being right where all the fresh feedings are going to get added each time going forward from now on. And today we're not adding any bedding. It's going to be food only. Kind of like what we did in the previous bin that we just fed. So let's get it in here and we'll be done. I think with this plastic bag I can just sort of grab the bottom of it and we'll just pour it out. This way we try to shake it out too while we're at it. Maybe we get the entire amount of it. Sometimes it likes to stick to the inside of the bag. That's why a good shake helps a lot. Get it out of there. Amount wise, it almost does seem like we may have given them a little bit more here. Not sure. But this sort of stuff I would hope is gonna, break down pretty readily. I was also theorizing maybe the absence of interest in that stuff that went through the food processor is maybe the absence of moisture. Because I did actually have to, kind of pour off a bunch of collected moisture that came together when I was making that pulverized stuff in the food processor. I did scoop out all the pulverized veggies and fruits and everything using a spoon, but a lot of the moisture that came together from the grinding process, I kind of just left it in the processor and I poured it off. So I think just by food processing it, we did actually release a lot of its moisture and it did not make its way into the bin here when it was fed to the worms. So maybe there is a benefit to just giving them small chunk stuff that still has all of its original moisture present within it. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's just something that the worms prefer a little bit more rather than the stuff that's been, ground up already for them. I don't know. I'm always trying different things, and the whole grinding up of food is one thing that I definitely don't do very often. So I just figure once in a while I just give it a try, and it's usually done because I've got just so much material on hand. The only way that I can keep it stored is by pulverizing it and kind of scooping it into a little tray or something and throwing it back in the freezer. But that stuff was, I don't even remember, it was a bunch of stuff that if I had left it whole intact, it would have been very difficult to find room for it. I really saved a lot of space just by running it through the food processor and turning it into that little pulp. So I think, yeah, here too we're going to make a slight deviation from the way we found the bin. You know what, I don't remember what we did on the last one. I think we did have a coffee filter indicating where we had last fed, so we'll do the same here since the one they had previously was gobbled up already. Just a little tradition. I like to mark where I fed. I usually do so using a coffee filter, mainly because I've got so many coffee filters. And since I am skimping on bedding these days, the paper sheets that I used to cover with on top are typically the only game in town for worms that want to get a little nibble of carbon-based food. So all we've got left to do here is really put the plastic covering back on. I hope without the cardboard top, we'll hopefully see fewer, or hopefully no, flying insects in here next time. I guess that's going to be the sort of watch item here now. What's up with flying insects? Hopefully they're not hanging out here anymore. because it did somehow seem like that cardboard was the one thing that they were really all drawn to. And without that being here, hopefully that's the end of the flying insects. Keep my fingers crossed. All right, everyone, I've only got a few things to put away here and get cleaned up, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.